Hello and welcome to the first episode of Encounter. The slogan of Think Global and Act Local has made people conscious of their cultural moorings. But in the process, culture has given birth to a conflict. On one hand, we have cultural jingoists who make a fetish of it. And on the other, we have got cosmopolitans who treat world as their Mother Earth, as their homeland. In between the two extremes, where lies the truth? And this is the subject for our discussion. And for that, we've invited a panel of eminent intellectuals who have contributed a great deal in their respective fields. I take the pleasure introducing them one by one. On my extreme left, Professor G.R. Malik, Professor of English Literature, who heads the Department of AVRC, Audio Visual Research Center, University of Kashmir. Next to him, Professor Shafi Shok, known for his unorthodox and iconoclastic views about culture and art and religion. Nice to have him here. And then Professor A.G. Madhosh, who has contributed substantially in the field of education and development, got retired as Dean Faculty of Education and contributed as Professor of Education. Nice to have you here. So we begin with this question, that what is culture in fact? How do we define culture, and need it be preserved at all?
You have asked two questions, in fact, in one. First, how to define culture, and can it be defined? Secondly, does culture require any extraneous help to be preserved? Both are very important questions. As far as the definition of culture is concerned, there cannot be one single matter-of-fact definition, because culture can be looked up from different points of view. We call a particular individual cultured and another individual not cultured.
Not cultured.
And you have a particular definition of culture at that time in mind. Similarly, we look upon the culture of a community, the culture of a group, or the culture of a whole nation. Basically, culture is a noun from the verb cultivate. And cultivation in this sense refers to the mental cultivation, to the emotional cultivation, to the moral cultivation. To me, all of these different aspects, whether you look upon it from moral, mental, or intellectual point of view, they constitute a single organic unity, because ultimately human existence is an organic unity. But the context in which we are discussing the problem, I think we have to take it in its collective connotation. The culture of a particular community, or the culture of a particular nation, or as you very rightly hinted in your introductory remarks, the supposed global culture, whether it exists or whether we can conceive of it at the moment that such a thing as a global culture can ever come into existence. As far as culture of a particular nation is concerned, say let us say Kashmir, the Kashmiri culture, I would say that it has a particular kind of existence which I think is impersonal, which I think is deterministic in character. It does not require our help in that sense. It does not require our help to preserve it. The question that should be asked in the right sense of the way in which we are approaching the problem is, should we be willing participants in the continuation and growth of a culture, rather than saying, should we preserve it? Because culture determines us. Culture determines our ways of thinking, our ways of feeling, our speech. Because the way we behave, the way we interact with each other, the way we live, the way we enjoy, the way we mourn, all these things together constitute our various cultural ways. And they are given to us, most of these ways are given to us rather than we create them. Of course, there is a kind of interaction between the individual and the culture in which he is born and brought up and has his being. Therefore, I think that the right way to put the question is that what should be the relationship between an individual and the culture in which he is born? How should he be a willing participant in the growth and development of that culture?
Professor Shafi Shok, is culture in itself a very nebulous word that we do not have any definition, one single definition we cannot have of the word culture?
Yeah. As Professor Malik Sahab rightly explained it, beautifully explained it, that we don't have a word to object correspondence between culture and what culture stands for. It is just a state, it is just a process, not a state. A state, if it were, it could be defined within certain limits, within certain references. But whenever we have the notion of culture in our minds, perhaps sometimes we have it as religion, sometimes we have it as our linguistic community, sometimes we have it as our hostility against our neighbor, sometimes we have it as our sense of history. But being it a superstructure of the socio-economic condition of a nation, which always remains changing, it does not have any static existence, because every nation has a right to grow economically, and whenever there is a shift from one economic structure to another, there is a corresponding shift in this superstructure also. But there are unfortunately some people who glorify abject misery, abject poverty, wretchedness of a nation, and call it a culture.
As their cultural assets.
As their cultural assets.
What they should have been ashamed of, in fact, they feel privileged about.
About it. And then we have cultural ministries, cultural secretaries, cultural directors, so many bureaucrats and so many ministers who pretend to protect those things. For instance, there is a big official bureaucratic structure that is there, that takes huge money to defend the Dalit culture. In the first instance, the use of the Dalit is shameful. But there are people who are there as the vanguards of preserving the Dalit culture, the Adivasi culture, as if the Adivasis has no right to evolve economically. And whenever there is an economic shift, then that shift in terms of that explicit culture, what we call the material culture, that vanishes. For instance, we are here as Kashmiris, but we are more English than the English people are. So what is it? So
the borders are very porous.
Extremely porous, because the economic structure and then the technological revolution that has overwhelmed the whole of the world in a uniform manner. That distinction vanishes. But unfortunately, for political reasons, we maintain those borders, we maintain those lines and contours of people, and then for political gains also.
Professor Madhosh, how would you like to respond to the comments already made by the two learned professors? And is culture too petty to be thrown out, or a wealth that we should stick to and preserve?
Actually, I would like to talk as a teacher. You see, once people start defining education, they would say that education has no other role than to transmit culture. And education in itself is a process which creates, conserves, and then presents cultural moorings and traditions, taboos, laws, you see, whatever. So from that point of view, if you take education as the custodian of certain culture belonging to our nation or to a state or to a group, then perhaps our eyes directly would concentrate upon two things. One, that there are certain material aspects, and these material aspects are connected with certain states, countries as a matter of fact. And these material aspects have their own values. Right from the history where it starts, you have those things with you. And therefore they become most important components of your culture. And their preservation, on one hand, is one of the duties and responsibilities of a particular nation to preserve. Because they are sometimes, I should say most of the times, direct enforcers. And second is the immaterial aspect, in which ideologies, faith, religion, customs, traditions, beliefs, norms, standards, etc. enter into individual's behavior where a unifying mechanism is found. That is why Ruth Benedict, one of the cultural anthropologists, said that culture of a particular group or a country ensures survival and unity among nations. So once we talk about culture, culture to me is a human thing first of all. So you can't be a human being without culture, as a matter of fact. But then the question is, are we in a position as a determinist to preserve it or not? There are certain things which, as a matter of fact, need survival. Whether you work for them or you do not work for them, they will continue definitely, because they have got their own individual integrity and the strength which ordinarily you cannot wipe out. And there are certain things, as Professor Shok, Professor Malik was hinting at, which actually have been temporarily created. Like, for instance, political intervention, which is very important these days. He was referring to Dalit cultures. See how hostilities are bred into cultural conflicts, as a matter of fact. That is how politically you look at culture. If within a broader context of culture, you start creating small cultures also, and you have the slogans for such cultures, naturally hostilities and the question of preservation would definitely come up. Is it that I am to protect Gujar culture, Pahari culture, Kashmiri culture, culture belonging to Leh culture, Jumuites culture, which culture? All these things have been created politically. Actually, I personally do not believe that they happen to be the components of culture, as a matter of fact. So perhaps, therefore, preservation question and importance question have got...
I apologize for interrupting.
Yes, of course. Just very briefly, two important points. One arising from my and Professor Shok's remarks. Because I think all of us, Professor Madhosh, me and Professor Shok, we agree that culture is essentially a process. And it is not anything which is static. My belief that it essentially rises from the collective unconscious of a people does not therefore mean that it is a static thing. It does grow, as I said, that it grows. The question is whether we become willing participants in that process of growth or not. That is the question, basic question. But Professor Madhosh has raised another very important question, that when you are talking of cultures, for instance, culture in relation to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which culture are you talking of? He referred to several cultures, Gujar culture and Jammuite culture and Kashmiri culture. Which culture? There I think we will have to broaden our horizons. Culture no doubt is determined by our geography, it is determined by our history, it is determined by religion, it is determined by our language, it is determined by socio-economic infrastructure. There's no doubt about that. But that if we start becoming willing participants, then we can perhaps take a cue from, say, Matthew Arnold, who defined culture as the best that was ever known and thought in the world. And thereby we can start widening our horizons and then taking the best that is available, wherever it is, and incorporating it into our respective cultures. There, that may lead ultimately to the growth of a culture which will be acceptable perhaps to all.
If the preservation...
Professor Shok, I'd like to mention here that what Nehru describes in Discovery of India by quoting Al-Biruni, who says that Indians think that theirs is the best culture, theirs is the best science, theirs is the best nation. And this narcissistic obsession about their nation, about their culture, do you think that this is essentially the thing that breeds the cultural hostility amongst groups that Professor Madhosh has spoken of?
Certainly, yes. The consciousness of cultural superiority arises when you have an enemy or a feel of the presence of an enemy.
Imaginary enemy.
Yes, almost goes like enemy. For instance, in the subcontinent, so long the hostility continues between Pakistan and India, and this question of cultural jingoism, this narcissism in terms of culture will always remain there. So long there is economic disparity in India, the cultural conflict between various classes, Dalits and Brahmins and Shudras and others will continue there. Similarly, in the case of state of Jammu and Kashmir, this cultural consciousness sometimes may lead us to fascism and sometimes to abject surrender also. For instance, if we become the fighters for the preservation of a certain culture of a certain community, then, for instance, I think we are imposing some other form of culture on that particular community. This is like this, for instance, there are the most poor people are living in Kalahari deserts, for instance. Till yesterday, they were the poorest people, for instance. But all of a sudden, hoodoo herb was discovered there, which is the only remedy of obesity. And the whole that herb, a small quantity of that herb sells in millions now. And all of a sudden, Kalahari deserts become millionaires. And all of a sudden, there's a big quantum leap in their cultural makeup. So they will have everything, whatever facility is their modern civilization has created, that facility will be there. Then where does that identity, cultural identity that they had previously?
Yes, sir, you mean that we should not gloat in the cultural assets that the ancestors had in the past? Because but does it mean, Professor Madhoj, does it mean that we should at the same time distance ourselves from the culture that we actually are rooted in?
Yes, you would not be able to distance yourself, because the culture, once we talk of culture, it is more or less a given thing. When Dr. Malik talks about the process, and process which happens to be in continuity and follows continuity, there's only changes that take place because of time, because of certain discoveries, inventions, and number of things that come up. And culture is such an accommodative thing that it starts getting it and gets absorbed into it and starts conserving it. The point that you were referring, once you were talking about Pandit Nehru, you see, the statement that he had made, you would see.
In fact, actually, he quoted Al-Biruni that he makes about India.
Yes, you see, look, at a certain point of time, I have found intellectuals defining culture as a way of intellectual operations. Means culture means how a nation's intellect is put to use. They would say that culture doesn't belong to those people who are just downtrodden, as a matter of fact. Culture has been created by such people who have fascinating intellect. And once you are talking of culture, you are talking of some ideological strength behind, some kind of attitude that you are possessing. And that attitude or that ideology or that phase has a strength of manpower behind. And once that is true, and that it happens to be true, then it is men alone who at certain points of time will feel that some ideologies are not working. And ideologies go out of your
mind. But then, Professor Madhoj, there is a point that don't you think that those nations who are politically strong, their culture lives and we as weaker nations have to follow them?
There is a point, sir. And the point is that you have two types of cultures available now globally. One is individualistic culture, which is being followed in the United States of America and West Germany. And they are collective forms of culture followed by this India and some of the countries of Europe. And once you talk of individualistic and collectivistic, of course this kind of question would not arise, because once you have individualistic culture, there the orientation is such a strong thing that right from a school child to the President of United States of America, they have a one pattern of thinking, one pattern of behavior, one pattern of attitude. It would be only nullified, discriminated, or identified as one single solitary habit.
Of course.
Whenever the protest takes place, you see, otherwise not.
Yes, Professor Malik, I'd like to have it from you on the basis of the experience that you had in Europe, that don't you think that those nations whom we call as emancipated or developed economically or politically are actually the cultural jingoists or chauvinists because they make the rest of the world follow them?
So before I come to your question, a much more important question was raised by Ijaz Sahib while talking to Professor Madhoj, that the culture of the dominant civilization, or whatever you call it, the dominant race,
dominant
of a particular
civilization,
historical period, yes, it tends to become popular because it does create in those who are the dominated races or dominated sections of humanity, it does create in them a consciousness that they are inferior, because the culture, which is the civilization which is in the dominant position, has automatically to be accepted as something which is superior. So it happens that those who consider themselves inferior start slavishly following.
But then where lies the fault?
But as far as the modern dominant civilization, that is the Western civilization is concerned, there is no doubt about it that they are very jealous about their culture. But I have learned from history that right from the earliest civilizations down to modern times, whichever civilization has been in the dominant position has always jealously guarded its own culture. Whoever was there, whether it were the Greeks, Alexander's Greeks, or the Romans, or the Islamic civilization, or the post-Renaissance Western civilization, more or less the attitude of the dominant civilization has always been to be very jealous about its culture and to see that this culture becomes a universal culture. And I believe that globalization may be ultimately a cover of imposing that dominant culture on the rest of the world.
Professor Shok, you'd like to respond?
Yes. I think that geographical definition of culture, for instance, Oriental and Occidental, Western, Eastern, or American, or British, French, or Chinese, that has already ceased to exist because modern man has become again a nomadic man. It is without a soil because we have distanced ourselves from that agrarian type of society when man would feel rooted in his soil. Modern children, the children of the next generation, they don't have that feel of rootedness. They freely travel from one country to another and do not have any kind of association.
But then don't you think that an Indian is an Indian first and then the citizen of the world, and same applies to the people in America or Europe or elsewhere?
Not necessarily. What defines him as an Indian? Because the Indianness itself has no definition except that he has a particular linguistic competence with him in Hindi language. The other aspects of his cultural recognition continuously change. His dress, etc., everything. The material aspect of culture is nothing but this actualization of man's innate irrationality, madness, I would call. For instance, this kind of dress that I am wearing, this is just a realization of my inner madness. My having collar, my not having mustaches, and somebody has mustaches. My
so deep down, somewhere in your heart, you try to follow something that is superior to you, that you have mentally accepted as superior to you.
No, whether we confess to that or not, the fact that we are wearing Western dress, the fact that we wear a necktie, the fact that we do try to follow the Western ways in our day-to-day behavior, whether we are conscious of it or not, means that there is a dominant civilization at the moment. It will not remain dominant forever. But at the moment it is there, and we consciously are...
Professor Madhosh, Professor Shok has raised a very important point of talking about Hindi language. Now, let's exclude the word Hindi from that. Let's talk about language that forms an indispensable part of culture. How should we... I mean, we as Kashmiris like to speak in Kashmiri language, but should it instill an element of pride in us that we are Kashmiri, or somebody is a Tamil, or somebody is a Gujarati, so far as the language is concerned, or the preservation of linguistic assets is concerned?
So, you see, once we talk of language happens to be the first major medium of expression, and through which definitely you are going to express your culture as well. But now, taking pride is another question. You see, you are having the Kashmiri language as a matter of fact. But then I look it from a different point of view. There is a facilitation process. You see, if you take language, even within the cultural goods that are available with me, if you take language as a facilitating process, yes, I can turn to be a very creative person, very imaginative person, very practically oriented person. Perhaps I would be the person who would develop my nation only when I am actually taught, brought, instructed, trained through the language that belongs to me. And that language is, it itself becomes a predominant thing in a culture, as a cultural input you grow. That's why, you see, now this time when I'm talking in English, the English is not my language, as a matter of fact. But I feel facilitated even if I talk in English, because that is the kaval, or whatever you talk in Hindi, that you can pick up from your school system as such. I would have personally liked that, of course, whether I like or not, this hardly matters, but then as Professor Malik very well, and I think perhaps unconsciously, rooted culture in the unconscious moorings of a person. There, of course, it emerges as a question of language. Therefore, taking pride only after creating pride for you. See, you have to create a situation. In that situation in which you will find that, yes, I am becoming. And whether you take yourself a pride or not, people around you would take pride. You see, if I can talk well in English, then people will say, who are just hearing me now, they will say, yes, of course, some education has made some impact on this gentleman. Why? Then I am actually disseminating things in the way which requires to show the discipline of one's mind. And discipline of one's mind must be one of the cultural goods that you are expressing through.
Language in itself is not a fixture as these fixtures around us are there. Right. Because it also continuously changes according to the education, the notions of an individual as well as the community, and the paraphernalia that surrounds us all the time. It also grows with the growth of culture. Right. So being an integral part of culture, or I may say the ultimate, if there is something ultimate, the LCM of a culture, it is of course language, but if taking pride in one's language ultimately leads to ignorance, fascism, and being
of course,
aggression.
Professor Shok, you take it to that far. Professor Malik, I'll come to you. Yes, of course.
Language is as much the index of a culture as it is determined by that culture. And I think there is a kind of interaction between the two, which is very difficult to define in a very short discussion. That we say, how does language affect culture, and how does culture in
But then we are here discussing about the inferiority and the superiority of the cultures. You'll correct me here that poets, maybe, I guess, I may not be correct here, Milton didn't write in English because he didn't want to lose audience. He wrote in Latin. I may not be correct here. So what made English a global language? Is it the superiority of the culture or the political setup of those cultures?
Well, that's a very difficult historical question. How do nations rise and fall? How do civilizations rise and fall? There was a time when even Milton felt ashamed in writing in English. He wrote in Latin. Therefore, there was no intrinsic quality there, intrinsic potential there, because of which they became dominant. Well, even Toynbee has been able not to define this thing. How does it happen that a particular community all of a sudden rises in history and becomes a dominant community or a particular nation? There are no final answers to this question, the rise and fall of it. But as long as the potential of a particular region or a particular race has not been properly tapped and realized, there are always possibilities that that particular race or that particular community or that particular region has yet chances to rise.
Sir, we're at the end of it now. The last question, and I'll have a brief view of from all of the experts that we have had. That do you think that small cultural conflicts snowball into big political battles between nations and nations?
That is a manipulation. I think that is a manipulation by the politicians. They have their own constructs, convenient constructs, and they trade them, they manipulate them, and they use their misinformation.
Otherwise, it does not have anything to do with it.
Otherwise, I don't think there are any potential conflicts between.
Professor Shok.
Yes, I don't think there is that the notion of superiority or inferiority applies to any culture or any language, because language and culture, they reflect the socio-economic condition of people. So there is no question of superiority.
I perfectly agree with these two intellectuals over here that yes, of course, these small things are created. You see, they don't belong to culture as such. They are things which are external. So thank you.
Professor Madhush, Professor Shok, and Professor Malik, I thank all of you for being here. So we sum it up here that culture is not something with concrete and solid definitions. With these words, we take your leave. Thank you very much.